So, Blue Lock Chapter 295 just released and quickly became one of the most talked about chapters in the whole series. And it makes sense. It was one of the most anticipated chapters of all time. People were gonna see the Munchen versus Barca match, final salaries, the conclusion of a 4-year arc, and of course, the #1 of the Neo Egoist League. However, when I said this became one of the most talked about chapters, it was not in a good way. I have never seen more people disappointed in one single chapter of this series ever. From the outcome of the chapter to the chapter itself, the whole thing was getting cooked harder than Blue Lock Season 2. This is probably the most discussion I've ever seen on a single chapter. There are people talking about how the writing fell off, none of it makes sense, even calling it the worst chapter of the series, which is where the title of this video comes from, and then others defending this chapter, saying that this is good writing, it all makes sense, and that people are overhating it. So of course, I want to put on my tinfoil hat and go into a deep dive on why people hate this chapter, and actually see if it is the worst chapter of Blue Lock, or are people really just overreacting to it. Alright, firstly, we have to cover the chapter really quickly to see what people dislike about it. The first thing is we start with a flashback of Nagi and Ryo, and this is already where the complaints start. The beginning 4 pages of this chapter was just a callback to things we already know, and when you have a 17-page chapter, that means almost 25% of the chapter is just flashbacks. It's always kind of been a complaint with Blue Lock. We read the manga, but they always try to re-explain everything in a 2 + 2 = 4 way. Like, we already know Nagi is having motivation problems and Ryo is on the verge of being eliminated. We read the manga. I honestly kind of get it. It's been a year since we did see them, but to dedicate almost 25% of the chapter to just flashbacks, it makes sense why people were immediately shut off by this chapter. So already a kind of bad start, but let's continue on with the main points. We of course finally get to see the Munchen versus Barca match, and when I mean see, I mean a very minimized cliffhanger version of the game. We basically see the start of everything and nothing else besides that. Basically no Nagi development or the results of the game, but we do see Ryo getting some development and Shigiri scoring a goal, as well as a Bachira appearance and an Atoya appearance. I know that this was a big complaint for a lot of people. Basically, we get a nothing burger from the pages talking about the game, but I gotta say, I don't hate this decision. It seems like we're gonna get more of the Munchen and Barca match, which is a good thing. It probably means we won't get some rush development of Nagi and Ryo, and we'll actually see it on screen instead of it being off screen. In the moment, it's definitely frustrating though. I see why people are complaining because, you know, it's just a nothing burger. We got like nothing from it, and it took up a lot of time for the salary rankings or the second half of the chapter. Now going into this, again, this is what everyone is anticipating, right? The final rankings, who's making it, who's gonna get eliminated, is there gonna be any surprises, who is the #1? So many questions that people were looking forward to. You can't help but just be antsy waiting for those salaries. The final bids are finally here, and to start it off, we get the #1 rankings. Completely different than any of the other rankings where we start from the bottom players, but I guess they're ripping off the band-aid and showing off the #1. Now, this part of the chapter is what everyone is talking about, because crowned at the #1 spot is none other than Itoshi Rin. This decision shocked everyone. I'm pretty sure I saw chairs flying across the room, because Rin being at #1 is sort of a surprise. Not only that, the salary was 240 million, which means the highest bid in Blue Lock is 240 million, so Isagi didn't surpass that, as well as it's kind of just a random number. The cherry on top is that he got a Real offer, which is the best club in the world, of course, where Itoshi Sai is as well. We'll talk more about Rin in a second, because there is something even bigger than that. Of course, Isagi tying Rin at #1 as well. Now, Isagi finally getting #1 is hype. I can't lie, seeing my boy all hyped up got me cheering for him too. However, he still did tie Rin at the #1 spot, and people are very confused and disappointed with this outcome, because they thought Isagi was gonna be the #1. And it sort of makes sense with Isagi's performance during this game. Isagi scored 2 goals, played defense so many times, and was the key player in Bastard's win. Analyzing this a little bit more, on Rin's side, individually, he had a really good performance, but at times sort of threw the game, whether it's not cooperating with the team, or that one shot he purposefully didn't shoot, or just ball hogging and only going after Isagi. In short terms, this was Isagi's best performance in a game, and Rin, although he performed good, I'm not denying that, he had some faults. So obviously, when you have someone playing perfectly, literally winning the whole thing, you think they're gonna take the #1 spot, but ends up Rin is alongside him, even though he fumbled at times. times, and that's what makes people mad, and the plot Toshi Rin allegations come back to life. It kind of dissolves Isagi's play a little bit. Like, even at his best, Rin is still equal to him and stays the best no matter if he misplays. So it dissipates Isagi's performance and makes it feel like there's no stakes. Isagi's best is still not enough to surpass Rin. I understand that there are some counter arguments, like how Rin had a salary lead, Rin was the best player on PXG. I'll go over all of that in just a second, but we're analyzing why people don't like this chapter, and that is the main reason. The reactions were also out of character, which a lot of people pointed out. Isagi, although his celebration is hype, he finally reached number 1, but bro is a little too happy sharing a spot with Rin. And the even bigger reaction was Rin didn't even crash out at Isagi tying him. If this was any other Rin, we'd see him casting a spell on Isagi, cursing him to death, but all of a sudden he's nonchalant, like Isagi isn't even a threat. So you can see why everyone is mad at the rankings, mad at the reactions. It didn't make a lot of sense to people, and to top it all off, the chapter ended with no other salaries. Basically, everything we got in this chapter made people mad, and people got even more mad because everything we didn't see in this chapter. No salaries, no Munchen conclusion. So let's really see if this crash out was valid. Going into the counter arguments, Munchen versus Barca, I think the expectation for this match was to get a definitive answer on what the hell happened to Nagi. We knew going into this chapter that the Munchen game was already finished, so a lot of people expected two things, either to see what the Munchen game resulted in, or just the salaries by itself. However, we got none of that, and there was just no closure on what happened, especially since they used 4 pages out of 17 pages on a recap of something we already know. Now, honestly, this was just pretty confusing. I thought we'd get a little more development in this chapter, or maybe just the ending of the game, like how every other off-screen NEL match was. And also, Ryo is probably safe now with an assist to Chigiri, so does that mean Nagi is at more of a risk than Ryo is in terms of salaries? I think this is something we can more or less gloss over for this chapter because it's probably going to be answered in the next chapter. Again, I do see why people are confused. They jump from the Munchen game to the salaries, so are they going back to the Munchen game, or are they continuing the salaries? I do think it's better overall to flush out their development by showing us the game. I just hope it's not rushed or underdeveloped because they're also mixing in the salaries, so it's a bit confusing. So I would say for the Munchen and Barca part, it's a little confusing. I'd rather they just not show us the salaries and show us the game and keep it in one consecutive order. It probably would have been better to do that instead, but overall, I think people are over-exaggerating this part a little bit because we're gonna get it in the next chapter, so people just have to be patient. Obviously, though, the big complaint about this chapter was the salary rankings. Firstly, we got no other salary rankings besides Isagi and Rin. At this point, yeah, I just gotta agree, it just seems way too dragged out. I think that's the biggest complaint about it. We obviously want to see the final rankings, especially since the PXG game lasted way longer than it should have. If we're seeing the full match of Munchen versus Barca as well, does that mean we're not gonna see the final rankings until that flashback finishes? Do they need more chapters for that? And who literally knows when that's gonna happen? So the pacing is definitely off. Again, this is another thing that gets solved with time, but we're talking about this individual chapter, and the chapter literally had none of that. So I would agree with this part about the salaries. Crash out is valid. I don't think it was a very good idea to just space it out. It always sucks when there's a cliffhanger, and this chapter was just full of cliffhangers for the Munchen game and final salaries, so it's making this chapter look pretty bad right now. And of course, the talk of the town about this chapter was Isagi and Rin tying in salaries. I kind of did cover why people are crashing out about this. It does feel like cop-out writing, still having Rin as the number 1, out of character reactions as well. Rin literally left this arc the same character he came in. For Isagi fans, they feel like they got robbed of the number 1 spot, and I didn't cover earlier, but Isagi got a bastard offer and not a real offer. So in general, people just feel like Rin got everything that Isagi deserved. Now, is the crash out valid for this, the salary rankings? I think both yes and no. I mean, you have the number 1 genius and number 1 talented learner, and the fact that Isagi had a little bit of a salary deficit to Rin. And Rin also still individually put up a good performance throughout this game, so even with Isagi scoring 2 goals, it wasn't enough to make him a clear-cut number 1. Now, whether or not Rin's performance deserved number 1 is a different answer, especially comparing his performance to Isagi's, but I guess the salary deficit really makes up for it. And I feel like the writing is just all about that talented learner learner being on the same level of geniuses, which is why they tied rather than one being above the other. You have the fact that Isagi still got like 90 million for this match, which is still really good. Double what Rin had as well for this match in terms of salary increases. So I guess he won in his own right. Overall though, it just feels like a half win, and that's understandable. The number one spot I feel like is supposed to be more defined, especially from a fan perspective. Fans are gonna eat you up if you don't have a defined number one, and so this is kind of a cop-out answer. I think it would have been better to either see Rin or preferably, you know, Isagi on the throne as the number one. Again, that whole writing of geniuses and talented learners being on the same level, I think that's what Kaneshiro is trying to go for. Now, whether or not you like that writing is up to you. Obviously, a majority of people dislike it, which is why this chapter was the most talked about, the most hated chapter. However, even with all of those counter arguments, I still think this chapter was like a half chapter. We seriously got half the pie. No salaries and no Nagi and no Reo development, no defined number one. So now that we know both sides, why people hate this chapter and why people like this chapter, let's answer the question, is this really Blue Lock's worst chapter? I gotta say, with all of the disappointment that happened, this is probably up there for one of the worst chapters. Now, when I say this, I mean individually as a chapter. Chapter 295, what we got from only this week. I feel like I'm preaching to the choir and I feel like a broken record. I actually feel like it's Blue Lock chapter right now, repeating the same thing over and over again. No salaries and no Nagi and Reo development and a no defined number one. Overall, though, there are some good points on both sides why this is a bad chapter narratively and also a good chapter narratively, like it builds up those genius and talented learner stuff. I think we just gotta trust in Kaneshiro and see where he's going with his decision. I'm kind of fine at this point. I personally don't even mind it that much, but I know for a lot of people it was very controversial, so I wanted to make this discussion video to talk with y'all as well. What are your thoughts on this chapter? Does it make sense? Do you like it, or do you think this is the worst chapter we have ever seen? I'm sort of rushing this video since the chapter just came out, so I might miss a few things, so leave it all in the comment section down below. Your thoughts. If you made it to the end though, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see y'all in the next one.